Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Accurate podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 8th of March here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, in his State of the Union speech, Joe Biden warns democracy is in danger as he tries to prove he's fit to serve 4 more years.
Cutting words, both Jerome Powell and Christine Lagarde say interest rate moves are close.
Plus, the women taking on big tech in Europe. We meet those enforcing the EU's data protection rules.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Joe Biden has used his State of the Union speech to breathe life into his re-election campaign as he warns that democracy is under threat in the United States. The US president painted his predecessor Donald Trump as responsible for those perils, despite never saying his name.
My purpose tonight is to wake up the Congress and alert the American people that this is no ordinary moment either. Not since President Lincoln and the Civil War have freedom and democracy been under assault at home as they are today.
Biden's spirited speech tried to put to rest fears that he's too old to run for office again. He also spoke of heartbreaking devastation in Gaza and announced military plans to unilaterally construct a new pier to deliver humanitarian aid to Palestinians.
Jerome Powell says the Fed is getting closer to being confident enough to cut interest rates. The central bank chair told the Senate Banking Committee that policymakers are still waiting for more certainty that inflation is coming down.
I think we're in the right place, which is we're waiting to become more confident that inflation is moving sustainably at 2%. When we do get that confidence, and we're not far from it, it'll be appropriate to begin to dial back the level of restriction so that we don't, drive the economy into recession rather than normalizing policy as the economy gets back to normal.
Powell's comments marked the second time he suggested the Fed is close to cutting during his semi-annual monetary policy testimony. On Wednesday, he said that it would likely be appropriate to cut rates at some point this year. 2-year Treasury yields fell following Powell's comments, while traders boosted bets on a June rate cut.
Meanwhile, the European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde is also indicating rate cuts could be on the horizon. Speaking after officials left rates unchanged, she said the monetary picture will become clearer in June.
We clearly need more evidence, more data, and we know that this data will come in the next few months. We will know a little more in April, but we will know a lot more in June.
The ECB's Christine Lagarde speaking there. The central bank's latest quarterly outlook revised the 2025 inflation forecast down to 2%, underpinning investor expectations of a first rate cut in June.
Banks and financial firms should be banned from using non-disclosure agreements in sexual harassment disputes. That's one finding from a parliamentary investigation called Sexism in the City, which found a, quote, shocking prevalence of sexual harassment and bullying still in financial services in the UK. The chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Harriet Baldwin, led the inquiry. She tells us progress on gender diversity and workplace culture has moved at a snail's pace.
For firms that don't get this right, it can actually cause businesses to unravel and actually potentially be a systemic risk. And there have been some high-profile cases where you could see that might be the case.
Baldwin cited OD Asset Management as an example of a company brought down by a lack of diversity. 3 more women brought forward new allegations this week on top of existing sexual misconduct lawsuits against Crispin Odey and his fund. Odey has denied all past allegations. A recent company filing suggests Odey could be planning a comeback, stating he is, quote, exploring alternative business opportunities.
And Taylor Swift's Eras Tour has prompted economists to upgrade their growth forecasts for Singapore, as the series of shows there are set to boost the country's economy. Gross domestic product likely grew by 2.9% in the 3 months to the end of March. That was the quickest pace in 6 quarters, according to median estimates in a Bloomberg survey. Annual growth expectations were also raised to 2.5%, closer to the government's 3% forecast for this year. The singer played 6 shows up until tomorrow night, in fact, and they'll bring in 300 to 400 million Singaporean dollars. Well, in a moment, we'll get more details on the State of the Union speech and bring you our story about the women taking on big tech in Europe. Another piece that caught our eye this morning from our Bloomberg Opinion colleague Laura Williams, writing ahead of this weekend. And if you're going to Oscars watcher,
yes, the bingo card, yes.
Yes, exactly. I've seen very little that's actually in the Oscars nominees list. I've just realised maybe that's my weekend homework. But Laura Williams has been writing about an interesting question that may be or should be asked on the red carpet, and that's the question of sustainability in what people are wearing and how that should feature in the conversations.
Yeah, okay. So not just, where's the outfit from? Who are you wearing? Yeah. It is what and how sustainable. There's a nice chart in this piece, which I hadn't understood, to be honest, that leather goods apparently and shoes make up a much larger environmental impact than other lines of business for these huge fashion conglomerates, of course, all the big names, Kering and so many others that will be on that red carpet. But yes, it's the leather goods and then shoes and everything else besides. Much, much smaller environmental impact. Perhaps I should have understood that, leather.
And it's something that Laura talks about as well in the piece, is that you can dismiss everything that's happening on the red carpet as being quite frivolous, but it has been a place that has started conversations about sustainability in fashion. She talks about Emma Watson's wearing that Calvin Klein outfit that was made out of plastic recycled bottles in the Met Gala, and that was 2016, and that started a conversation about how that was going as well. So hopefully people have been picking sustainable shoes ahead of the Oscars.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I hope you enjoy that if you're watching it over the weekend. Let's think about something else that happened in the US, shall we? President Biden's State of the Union address. It hit out at his likely rival for the presidency in November, Donald Trump, although not by name. Biden talked about the threat to freedom and democracy, his achievements in his first term, and he promised to restore abortion rights. But more voters than ever are concerned about President Biden's age. Joining us now to discuss is our Washington editor, John Harney. John, good morning. What criticisms did Joe Biden make of Donald Trump?
Well, it was a pretty wide range from the January 6th insurrection and the threat to democracy to Ukraine and the lack of assistance, further assistance so far for that country, and also the border bill that Donald Trump said should not pass, that Republicans should not vote for, as well, and abortion rights, and also taxes, which is often a Republican issue. He criticized Trump's tax overhaul of 2017, saying it benefited the rich and not the middle class. And the speech was clearly aimed at the middle class. I mean, it was to those who really will decide, to those who decide the election.
John, was this speech a success for Joe Biden, given the questions that are being asked about whether he's fit to run for another 4 years?
Well, like everything else in this country, that the answer falls largely along party lines. However, he did seem to have quite a bit of energy, and the speech was pretty focused and combative, as you said earlier. He clearly indicate it was clear that Donald Trump himself will be an issue, maybe the issue of the Democratic campaign going forward. And certainly the reaction of senators, congresspeople, others as he left. He spent nearly as much time, I would say, coming in and leaving the chamber as he did making the speech. Because don't forget, he's a creature. He spent much of his career at the Capitol.
Yeah. What did Biden then tout as his successes, and what's the second term agenda? Because, we mentioned abortion rights. There's also the issue around IVF. There were a lot of, it's quite symbolic, isn't it? The people that the president brings into the chamber for this sort of big annual speech. What did Biden tout as his successes?
Well, I mean, he also had the Prime Minister of Sweden, and Sweden, of course, just joined NATO on Thursday, and that's part of his continuing effort to strengthen the NATO alliance. And that came, of course, with warnings that Vladimir Putin could not be ignored, and that his aggression would not stop at Ukraine. And also, and there was also, the taxes on corporations, higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy, which he has, which he ran on before in 2020, and which also and given that the House is now in Republican hands, stands very little chance of passage. But it still is a marker. It shows how he differentiates himself from the Republicans and Donald Trump.
Yeah, and moves us into another gear for the US election campaign ahead. John Harney in Washington, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on the State of the Union speech.
Now, let's turn our attention to Europe. Data protection law has seen huge change over the past decade, with Europe leading the way by imposing tough new rules, the now famous GDPR that's become a global standard. European data watchdogs received unprecedented fining powers with the new rules when they kicked in almost 6 years ago. And a lot of women who traditionally worked in data protection were propelled into leading positions as regulators in charge of ensuring compliance for the world's biggest tech firms. Joining us now is our EU legal reporter, Stephanie Bodoni, on this special feature story. Stephanie, welcome to the programme. Europe seems to have become a bit of a role model in making sure people's data is protected by the world's biggest tech firms. Why is that?
Hi, good morning. Yeah, I mean, it is GDPR really changed a lot of things. It kicked in May 2018, and overnight, these data protection regulators in Europe that really had very, very small powers, I mean, really no powers at all. Fines could go up to 150,000 euros maximum by some, and some even had no powers at all to issue fines. GDPR suddenly allowed all of these regulators, there's about 30 that impose GDPR, to give fines up to 4% of a company's annual turnover. So it made a huge change. And what happened is that suddenly companies were very much more aware that there was something happening here that they had to be taking measures, against and for.
We're talking about GDPR being enforced now for almost 6 years, Stephanie. How well is it working? How has it been applied?
Well, you would think that GDPR, given the powers that it has, is quite a strong tool that regulators now have in their hands. But the problem is today, I mean, it's working quite well, but one of the problems is that it is being enforced by 30 regulators. And there are certain rules, procedural rules, that guide how they need to do it. So let's say you have a regulator getting complaints against Meta, and they, about data infringements and so on. And how it works is that it's the regulator where the company has its EU base that is in charge of enforcing GDPR. So in the case of Meta, that is the Irish Data Protection Commission, where Meta has its EU base. But the problem is the Irish Data Protection Regulator cannot impose or take decisions on its own. So it can do the probe, but to get a final decision, it needs to have the backing of all the other regulators that are part of the system, so the other 29. And that sometimes can lead to some tensions. And they're trying to work on it with the help of EU regulators, but it's a bit clunky so far.
Mm. Your piece is also a really interesting profile because some of the main regulators in charge in this sector of reining in big tech companies are women. Yes,
that's something that kind of, I mean, I've been covering this area for a very long time, and I've seen really the evolution. And I remember when I started looking into data protection issues more than 10 years ago, a lot of the regulators enforcing it, I mean, still rather toothless regulators, were men. And suddenly I realized that around 2014, so about 10 years ago, more and more female regulators were appointed to these posts. Now, they're not all former lawyers, but they're all people who have kind of worked in those areas. Obviously, one of the biggest names that some people who have been following this area might know is Helen Dixon. She was the Irish data protection regulator until last month, and she'd been in the post for about 10 years. And she's been the subject of a lot of criticism, but at the same time also has had the biggest power, because basically almost all of Silicon Valley's biggest tech firms have an EU base in Ireland. So with GDPR, her office were propelled overnight into being the lead watchdog in the EU for all these big tech firms. And of course, that created a lot of attention going towards Ireland, a lot of criticism, but she's also issued some of the biggest fines, around 2.8 billion fines in about 10 years. I mean, which is a lot, looking at how before they had no powers really at all.
Okay, Stephanie Bodoni, our EU legal reporter, thank you for bringing us details of that story. You can read more on the Bloomberg website, Meet the Women Taking on Big Tech in Europe, of course, on Bloomberg.com and on the terminal as well. Well, let's turn to one of our top interviews now. It's International Women's Day, but do women in the city feel celebrated? A new report into sexism in the City of London has found little changed in the past 5 years.
Yeah, I sat down with the Treasury Select Committee Chair Harriet Baldwin, who led that inquiry. It's 5 years on from the last inquiry that the Treasury Select Committee did into the City of London. I asked Harriet Baldwin about then the state of diversity, gender diversity in UK finance. Have a listen.
Progress is happening at a snail's pace. I think this is such an important issue for growth and for competitiveness, because obviously for the sector to thrive and grow further, it really needs to make sure that it works for everyone, that it attracts and retains the very best talent. And we were disappointed, I think, in this inquiry to see how little progress has been made over the last 5 years.
You heard from a lot of people about the prevalence of harassment and bullying, sexual assault and rape in financial services. The report calls it shocking. Some of the testimony was private. Just tell me about the experience of speaking to those individuals and what that testimony was like.
It was extremely eye-opening to think that in this almost second quarter of the 21st century, that there are workplace cultures that could be as unconducive to women thriving as some of the testimony that we heard. We were particularly concerned that it seemed to be prevalent, particularly in smaller firms, in boutique-like firms in a wide range of parts of the industry. But there was a particular issue around business events, around conferences, around some of the out-of-hours activities. And I think that's an area where, we wanted to flag up some of this really quite shocking evidence.
OK, so we'll get on to what can be done then around perhaps smaller firms. The report repeatedly says it is the responsibility of senior leaders to bring about cultural change. But there's a danger that they are treating a DE&I as tick box exercises. What is the incentive for senior leaders to address these issues?
Well, it's obviously an issue around talent, and you want everyone to be able to prosper and thrive in your sector. It's a competitive advantage. There have been studies, I think the most recent one was from BlackRock, that showed that firms that get this right, have greater success and higher profits. So it is really important. And what we think in terms of this sector, which is such a strong sector for the UK, is that it can be a real competitive advantage if we get this right. Now, you're highlighting the fact that we think the responsibility ought to be on firms and firm leadership, because it's obviously in their interest. And we've slightly shied away from thinking this ought to be something that the regulator insists on as a tick box exercise, because we want to see the focus be on culture rather than just on collecting data.
Okay. The thing is, there is a debate over the evidence of the commercial benefits from DE&I. Elon Musk and Bill Ackman are campaigning against it. You also talk about how it's the responsibility of investors too to hold firms to account for DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion. If it were up to some investors, there would be no DEI at all.
Well, I think that there's increasingly compelling evidence. As I say, I've pointed to that BlackRock study, and it just makes complete sense, doesn't it? If you're in an industry which is very reliant on human talent, that you want to make the industry as welcoming as possible to attracting, retaining, and developing human talent wherever it comes from.
You say there are, quote, several high-profile cases which show the existential risk to firms who don't tackle sexual misconduct. People who do follow those high-profile cases, though, can see for themselves in some instances that it's far from existential, either for the companies or the individuals who face these allegations. Critics might be a bit concerned about a statement like that.
Well, it's a statement that we've made, and obviously we're provoking discussion by making that statement. But I do think that this was partly behind the Prudential Regulation Authority's consultation, that they're concerned that for firms that don't get this right, it can actually cause businesses to unravel and actually potentially be a systemic risk. And there have been some, as you say, high-profile cases where you could see that might be the case.
The report talks about the cultures being perhaps worse at smaller firms, such as hedge funds, which wouldn't be affected by the regulatory changes. Is there anything that you would suggest which would help those firms in particular?
Yeah, what we've recommended, beyond this issue around the non-disclosure agreements is we think pay gap reporting, which currently covers firms down to the 250 employee mark, could be widened by the government down to firms with 50 plus employees. Pay gap reporting, it's a good proxy, isn't it, for how people are making sure that there is progress for women in terms of pay in their firms. So I think that was the recommendation that we chose to put in our report.
Is there a firm that you can think of, going back to your previous comments, is there a firm at all that you can think of in the UK that has unravelled due to the lack of diversity or issues around DEI? Yeah,
the one that's been widely reported was obviously before in terms of reference of our inquiry, but the incidents happened before 2018, was OD Asset Management.
You also talk a lot about men and about their role within the financial services sector, the emphasis being on helping women to avoid the known bad actors. That was the sort of finding that you concluded, rather than on tackling the inappropriate behaviour itself that women might face in the workplace. What is your message then to men on this score? And you did interview also a number of men involved in this space.
Yeah, and I've always found in my professional career in this sector and now, in politics, I always find the greatest feminists I ever come across are men with daughters. And, so my message would be to male leaders in this sector, is this the kind of behaviour you would feel comfortable if it were happening to your own daughter? And then think about it in that context. And actually that can really help people realise when they need to call out bad behaviour.
What would you say to critics who point out that the Treasury Select Committee has no black, ethnic, minority background or disabled members?
Well, it's entirely up to the House as to who they elect to the committee. We are currently short one Labour member on our committee, and it would be wonderful if the Labour Party would nominate someone to that vacancy.
It's pretty disappointing, isn't it, that 5 years on from the last major bit of work that your committee sort of led the charge on, we've made so little progress in the UK.
Well, we hope that our report will act as a wake-up call and that a lot of people will see the recommendations, act on them, and that any successor committee to ours in 5 years' time will see some real progress.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.